My own son tried to steal my house from me last Tuesday at 6:47 in the evening, and I caught him on tape. My name is Eleanor Kowalski. I am 94 years old, and the paper he slid across my kitchen table would have put me in a nursing home in Waterbury by Thanksgiving. He would not look me in the eye when he did it. He stared at the salt shaker like it had personally insulted him. My tea was going cold between my shaking hands, and in that one quiet, horrifying moment, I finally understood something I had been refusing to understand for almost a decade. My children were not loving me. They were waiting for me, and the gap between those two things is wide enough to drop an entire lifetime into and never hear it hit the bottom. However, what Daniel did not know that Tuesday night was that I had already found his sister's handwriting on a post-it note. I had already found the forged checks, and I had already found something in Walter's garage that was about to burn their entire plan to the ground. This is 412 Linden Street in Ridgefield, Connecticut, 40 minutes outside of Hartford, and my Walter and I bought this house on September 14th, 1964 for $19,400. The realtor was a man named Harold Pemberton, who smelled like pipe tobacco and cheap aftershave, and he told us we were insane for spending that kind of money on what was basically a cow pasture with a foundation. Last March, my lawyer had this same house appraised at $842,000. But the money is not what my children were really stealing. My daughter Margaret Ann was born at St. Francis Hospital on March 3, 1966. And I carried her home to a nursery I had painted pale yellow because the delivery doctor refused to tell us whether we were having a boy or a girl. My son Daniel Walter came screaming into the world on November 11, 1968, and he had colic for 7 straight months. And I walked him up and down this upstairs hallway so many nights that the floorboards remember my footsteps better than they remember my own face. Walter proposed to me a second time on the front porch on our 25th anniversary, June 8th, 1988, on his arthritic knees in the pouring rain, and the fool dropped the ring into my geraniums, and we spent 20 minutes crawling through wet dirt looking for it. That is what my children were trying to sell, not a house. A cathedral built out of 61 years of my actual heartbeats. And they were willing to lie to a doctor about my brain to get the deed. Walter died in that garage on February 9th, 2020, 3 weeks before the whole world shut for the pandemic. Heart attack, with a wrench still in his hand, which was the most Walter way to die a man could possibly choose, because that stubborn old Polish bulldog loved his garage more than he loved most of his living blood relatives. At the funeral, Daniel gave a eulogy that knocked me sideways into the front pew. Margaret held my hand through the entire receiving line for 3 straight hours and did not let go one single time. They were perfect children for about 4 months. However, around the end of June that same year, something shifted in a way I could feel in my stomach long before I could put it into words. The phone calls got shorter. The visits stopped being spontaneous. Margaret's voice started sounding distracted on the other end of the line, like she was scrolling through her phone while pretending to listen to me talk about my tomato plants. And then came the conversation I now recognize as Ground Zero. Daniel was sitting on my blue living room couch, drinking my iced tea, and he said, "Mom, have you given any thought to what you want to do with the house? You know, long term." I told him I wanted to die in it. He laughed, like I had told him a joke. But I was not joking, and somewhere in the oldest animal part of my brain, a warning bell started ringing that I chose to ignore. Because what mother on this earth wants to believe her own son is quietly measuring her for a coffin? I should have listened to that bell. That bell was telling me the truth 2 whole years before I was ready to hear it. They came at me with casseroles. Starting in the fall of 2021, my Margaret began showing up every single Sunday afternoon with a warm Pyrex dish in her hands, chicken and rice, tuna noodles, that weird tater tot thing her husband Brian eats. And I ate it up, the food and the attention. Because when you are a widow in your 70s, and the other side of your bed has been cold for over 600 nights, somebody walking through your front door with a warm meal feels like medicine for a wound you did not know was still bleeding. However, every casserole came with the exact same questions. Mom, how is your memory lately? Mom, have you been forgetting things? Mom, do you remember what we talked about last Tuesday? Daniel's visits were different from his sister's. He would wander. He would open my hallway closet for no reason a human being could name out loud. He would disappear into the basement for 20 minutes at a time, and I could hear him moving boxes around down there. One Sunday afternoon, I watched him run his hand slowly along the wooden banister Walter carved by hand in the winter of 1971, and a cold little punch landed in my chest. Because he was not touching that banister like a son. He was touching it like a real estate agent. According to a 2023 report from the National Council on Aging, 1 in 10 Americans over the age of 65 will experience some form of elder abuse, and in nearly 60% of financial cases, the thief is somebody you raised, somebody you fed, somebody whose fever you brought down at 3 o'clock in the morning with a wet washcloth and a whispered prayer. I read that statistic in a pamphlet at Dr. Patel's office, and I actually laughed out loud. I thought, thank God, that will never be my family. Rita, that was already my family. I just did not have the eyes to see it yet. And the move that came next was the one that almost buried me alive. Margaret called me on the morning of April 4th of this year, with a voice so sticky sweet I could practically taste it through the phone. She had found me a wonderful new doctor who specialized in geriatric care. My old doctor, Rohit Patel, who had been my physician since 2002 and cried quietly in the back pew at Walter's funeral, was apparently not equipped for someone my age. The new doctor was a man named Martin Brennan. His office was in a brand new medical plaza off Route 7. Margaret had already filled out every single piece of paperwork on my behalf. All I had to do was show up. So I showed up. Dr. Brennan was in his 50s, wore a watch that cost more than my first car, and had the kind of soft hands that have never changed a tire or held a dying man on a garage floor. He spent 45 minutes asking me questions that had absolutely nothing to do with my body. What year is it? Who is the president? Can you count backwards from 100 by sevens? Spell the word world backwards. I taught third grade in the Ridgefield public school system for 31 years, and I am not stupid, and I knew exactly what a cognitive capacity evaluation looked like, because I watched my own mother, Helena, take one in the spring of 1987, right before my brother Stanley put her in a state home in New Britain that she begged me on the telephone not to let him send her to. However, the part that made the blood freeze inside my veins was what happened at the very end of that appointment. Dr. Brennan handed a manila folder directly to Margaret. Not to me, to Margaret, and my daughter tucked that folder into her brown leather purse like she was holding a winning Powerball ticket. I did not say one word the entire drive home, but at 10:14 p.m. that same night, I made the phone call that saved my life. Her name is Sophia Rose Kowalski. She is 26 years old. She is my son Daniel's only daughter, and she is a single human being with my blood in her veins, who I trust with my actual soul. Sophie works as a paralegal at a Hartford firm called Abrams, Lindsay, and Chen, which is a fancy, polite way of saying she works for sharks and knows where every body in Connecticut is buried. I never call anybody at 10 o'clock at night because my whole generation believes a phone call after 9 p.m. means somebody has died. Sophie picked up on the second ring. I told her everything. The casseroles, the memory questions, the new doctor, the folder, the way Daniel ran his hand along Walter's banister like he was already drawing up the listing photos. Sophie went completely silent for maybe 10 long seconds, and then she said the words I will carry to my grave. Grandma, listen to me. Do not sign anything. Do not sign one single piece of paper. I am driving up first thing in the morning, and my granddaughter hung up before I could even think to argue with her. At exactly 7:28 the next morning, Sophie was standing on my front porch with 2 coffees from Dunkin', a yellow legal pad, and the face of a woman who had not slept 1 minute all night. However, the hardest part of this whole story was not what my children had done to me. It was what Sophie was about to find inside my own house that weekend. Sophie stayed with me the entire weekend. She went through every piece of mail on my desk. She pulled every folder out of the metal filing cabinet Walter bought at a yard sale in 1983. She made me log into my Citizens bank account, which I had not checked in nearly 5 months because my Walter always handled the money, and online banking still makes my hands shake. And what she found there made my granddaughter sit right down on my kitchen linoleum with her legs crossed like a small child, 3 checks, $2,000 each. All 3 made out to cash. All 3 signed with a shaky signature that looked almost like mine and absolutely was not mine. The dates: November 3rd, 2022, February 18th, 2023, July 9th, 2023. $6,000 quietly bled out of my checking account that I never wrote and never authorized. According to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, elder fraud losses in America hit a record $3.4 billion in 2023, up 11% from the previous year. And the average victim over the age of 60 loses around $33,000 to somebody they trusted. I had been bled for $6,000 and had not noticed. Because who checks their bank statements after being married to a man named Walter Kowalski for 54 years? However, the forged checks were not even the worst thing Sophie pulled out of that cabinet. The worst thing was a rough draft of a power of attorney naming Daniel Walter Kowalski as my legal guardian, sitting in the back of my own filing cabinet in my own bedroom. Stuck to the top of it with a yellow post-it note in Margaret's unmistakable loopy handwriting were 7 words that made my hands go completely numb. Get her to sign after Brennan visit. After the Brennan visit, my children were not just waiting for me to die. They were trying to have me legally declared incompetent so they could sell this house right out from under me while I was still breathing inside of it, still making pierogi in this kitchen, still watering Walter's rose bushes every morning at sunrise. And that is when I remembered the coffee can. My husband Walter was born on August 22nd, 1932. His father, Stefan, lost every penny he had in the spring of 1933, and for the rest of Walter's long life, the idea of putting money into a bank where strangers could touch it was the same thing in his mind as setting that money on fire in the backyard. So for 41 years, from 1979 until the day he died holding a wrench, Walter kept what he called his tea fund inside an empty Maxwell House coffee can, taped to the underside of the workbench in our garage. I had known about that can for decades. However, I had not touched it since the day after his funeral, because just looking at it made me cry. When Sophie asked me that Saturday morning if there was anything in this house my children did not know about, I almost said no. But something, and I swear on Walter's grave it felt exactly like my husband reaching from the other side of the dirt and tapping me on the shoulder. Something made me remember. Sophie and I walked out to that cold garage together in our slippers. We peeled 3 layers of duct tape off the underside of Walter's workbench, and inside that rusty old Maxwell House coffee can, wrapped carefully in newspapers dated 1994, was $47,360 in folded cash. My Walter, the same man who would argue with me for 20 minutes about whether we could afford to turn the heat up 2 degrees in January, had been quietly squirreling away money for 4 straight decades and had never once breathed a word of it to Daniel or Margaret. Sophie looked at me with her mouth hanging open and said, "Grandma, this changes everything." And she was absolutely right, because with that money I could hire a real lawyer, and with a real lawyer I could set a real trap. Most grandmothers in my exact position would have done something very different at this point. Most grandmothers would have cried. Most grandmothers would have called their children and asked them to please, please, just explain. Most grandmothers would have forgiven them, because forgiving is what the women of my generation were trained from birth to do. To swallow every insult and call it grace, to turn every cheek until both sides of our faces were bruised. However, I am not most grandmothers. I buried a baby boy named Thomas James in October of 1969, after he lived for exactly 9 days on this earth. I lost my younger sister Katarzyna to breast cancer in the winter of 1998. I watched Walter collapse on a cold concrete floor with motor oil on his hands. I am not soft. Old is a completely different thing from soft. And an old woman who has been pushed this far has absolutely nothing left in this world to lose. Sophie and I drove into downtown Hartford that Monday morning, and we hired a lawyer named Diane Okonkwo, a sharp woman who specializes in elder law. When I finished telling Diane my whole story, she leaned back in her leather office chair and said exactly one word: predictable, predictable. As if my own children had been following a script that thousands of greedy, rotten children had already written before them. Diane told us we needed hard evidence, the kind that would survive a real courtroom. Therefore, on Saturday afternoon, Sophie taped a small Olympus digital voice recorder to the underside of my kitchen table with 3 layers of painter's tape. And then I picked up my kitchen telephone and I invited my children over for Tuesday dinner. Tuesday, October 17th, 6:47 p.m. I told Daniel and Margaret on the phone that I had been thinking about the future and wanted to talk about some things. I could practically hear Margaret's mouth watering through the telephone line. They arrived at my front door at exactly 6 p.m., carrying a $12 bottle of cheap Merlot. I knew for a fact they had bought at the Sunoco gas station on Route 7, because Margaret has been embarrassingly cheap since the day she got her first allowance in the fall of 1974. I served them my pierogi, made with the same recipe my grandmother Jadwiga taught me, in a tiny kitchen in Bridgeport in the summer of 1941. The same recipe I tried to teach Margaret 30 years ago, and that she has never once in her life made correctly. We ate. We drank bad wine. And at exactly 6:47 p.m., according to the clock on my microwave, Daniel reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out the paper. The power of attorney, cleaned up now, typed on heavy cream-colored paper, with 3 little yellow sticky tabs marking exactly where his mother was supposed to sign her name. Daniel slid the document slowly across my kitchen table toward me. He stared at the salt shaker, Margaret stared into her wineglass, and the little Olympus voice recorder, taped underneath that table on a fresh 9-volt battery, quietly captured every single word that was about to come out of my 94-year-old mouth. I picked up the paper. I looked at it for one long, slow moment. I set it back down gently on my checkered tablecloth, and then I said very quietly, "Daniel, Margaret, I know about the 3 checks written to cash. I know about Dr. Brennan and the manila folder. I know about the post-it note in your sister's handwriting. And I know all about your little plan to put your own mother in a nursing home in Waterbury so the 2 of you can sell this house and split $840,000 before I am cold in the ground." The silence inside my kitchen could have stopped a freight train. Margaret burst into tears immediately, which I had completely expected, because Margaret has been crying on command since she was 3 years old and figured out it worked on her father every single time. Daniel went the exact color of uncooked bread dough, a gray-white shade I have never seen on a human face before or since. He opened his mouth to try to say something, and I held up one hand to stop him, and I said, "I am not finished speaking. I have already hired Diana Conquo. I already have the bank records printed out. I have this entire conversation on tape, right here in this kitchen, right now. And tomorrow morning, the only inheritance you 2 are getting from your mother is a telephone call from the Hartford County District Attorney's Office." Margaret threw up in my kitchen sink. Daniel did not speak another word. They left my house at 7:12 p.m., and I have not laid eyes on either one of them since. Daniel did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that part, because real life is not a movie, and the legal system in this country does not exist to punish middle-class white men in golf shirts who sell insurance for a living. However, here is exactly what did happen. On November 2nd of last year, with Diane Okonkwo's help, I removed Daniel and Margaret from my will entirely. Every single dollar I own, this house, Walter's coffee can money, my teacher's pension from 31 years in the Ridgefield Public Schools. Every penny will now go to my granddaughter, Sophia Rose Kowalski, on the day I die. Not 1 cent to my 2 children. I also filed a civil suit against Daniel for the $6,000 in forged checks, and his lawyer settled out of court within 9 days because, in Diane's exact professional words, that recording is absolutely devastating. And the part I think about every single night before I fall asleep is this: I am still here. I am still sitting inside my own house. I still drink my morning tea at the same scarred wooden kitchen table where Walter and I ate breakfast together for 6 straight decades. And my own 2 children, the ones who were counting down the days until their mother was dead so they could cash her in like a savings bond, have not been allowed to set 1 foot on this property in 11 straight months. Sophie drives up from Hartford every Sunday afternoon now. She brings me the good coffee, not the Dunkin', the fancy kind, from the little shop on Pratt Street she swears by. She sits right where her father Daniel used to sit. And she tells me about her boyfriend Marcus, a high school history teacher I have already decided I approve of, even though I have not met him yet. We do not talk about Daniel or Margaret. We do not need to. They sent a Christmas card last December. I threw it into the fireplace without opening the envelope, and I watched that rose-patterned paper curl up and turn black in the flames, and I felt absolutely nothing, which is its own very quiet kind of justice.